This is just fabulous to see all of you here. I'm so pleased that you joined us this evening. On behalf of the Department of Communication and Media, the College of Liberal Arts, the Rice Library, and the USI Foundation, I just welcome you to this important community event about banning and restricting access to books. Although today the university is often associated with its role in producing a skilled workforce, this conception for any university only features a part of its mission. Universities are places where students, faculty, and community members come together to share ideas, evaluate information, engage in innovation, and practice civil communication that brings us together. Such conversations are essential to a fully informed citizenship, one engaged with the community and who works toward the common good while making a positive difference. Although true of all faculty at USI, those of us in the liberal arts are particularly committed to learning more ourselves and to helping our students develop intellectually by exposing them to a variety of ideas that provide a foundation for wise personal, professional, and social choices. Tonight we gather to promote these rich traditions and to celebrate the opportunity to learn from each other. Perhaps like many of you, I was fortunate enough as a young person to read what I like. Honestly, my parents just wanted us to read, and reading anything would have worked for them. I was fairly old and clearly quite naive when I learned that others did not have that ability, and that in some times and places, books were actually burned. A look at U.S. history reveals that book bans have frequently occurred in the U.S., with the first ban in America occurring in 1637 when Puritans hoped to eradicate Thomas Morton's book, New English Canaan, which published stories about how Puritans treated indigenous people. Although literary scholars such as Sarah Ribbett assert that it is hard to draw a line between then and now, both eras clearly point to the power and perhaps in some cases fear of books. Tonight we are pleased to offer our community the opportunity to learn more about book restrictions, their significance to personal identity, to education, to freedom and expression, and what alternatives exist when seeking resolution for this contentious issue. We will start the evening with a short presentation, which will be followed by a moderated discussion, and then pending time will open the floor for some discussions. As some of you heard, we have a reception to follow, and I'm a firm believer in no food left behind. With that said, I'd like to introduce to you our speaker tonight, Mr. Sanford Ungar, an American journalist, author, and the inaugural director of the Free Speech Project at Georgetown University. Mr. Ungar graduated from Harvard College with an undergraduate degree in government and from the London School of Economics with a master's degree in international history. At graduate school, he lived abroad, serving as a correspondent for the United Press International in Paris, and then in Newsweek in Nairobi. Upon his return to the U.S., he worked as a journalist at the Washington Post, as well as the Washington editor of The Atlantic, managing editor of foreign policy, and a special correspondent for The Economist. His book, The Papers and the Papers, an account of the legal and political battle over the Pentagon Papers, won him a George Polk Award. He has been the voice of NPR's All Things Considered, the 24th director of the Voice of America, Dean of Communication at the American University, and president of Goucher College. He is a member of the boards of organizations such as the American College of Mediterranean, International Student Exchange Program, and the Institute for the Study of Diplomacy at Georgetown University, where he teaches undergraduate seminars on free speech and directs the Free Speech Project. The title of his talk is Banning Books to Please Parents, the Political Assault on Free Expression. Please welcome Mr. Sanford Ungar.
Thank you, Leanne, and I want to thank you and your colleagues in the communication program here for welcoming me so warmly. on my second visit to the University of Southern Indiana, a place that I've come to admire and enjoy very much. I'm glad to be back. You know, sometimes it's difficult to figure out how a serious threat to free expression and intellectual curiosity suddenly, or seems to be sudden, gets underway. In this case, it all seems to have begun with a simple enough premise. American parents just want to be the primary educators of their own children. They know them best, of course, and so obviously they know what's best for them, right? If that means playing hardball with school boards, administrators, journalists, and librarians, so be it. And this turned out to be a super convenient thing for some local elected officials and others planning to run for public office. It was time to, as they said, take back our schools and all that jazz. No more history, please, packed with difficult concepts like slavery, which might, after all, make white kids feel bad. No more so-called critical race theory, whatever that turns out to mean. Better to have a curriculum that stresses all that is great about America. And not a good idea to pay too much attention to some teenagers and others' so-called alternative lifestyles or other signs of dangerous wokeness. Above all, watch out for what they're reading. Wink, wink. Before long, the riled-up parents really had something going. They were now talking about how other people's children should be educated. They had lists of books to avoid, or better yet, to ban. And librarians, time for librarians to investigate, to be investigated for shelving those books in the wrong place, those dangerous books. And excitingly enough to some of these newly discovered public enemies, librarians, have even faced criminal charges. And then there was a little bonfire one evening last year outside of Nashville, drawn by a charismatic local pastor. Solid citizens grinning from ear to ear showed up to throw in their least favorite volumes, Harry Potter even, maybe even unexpurgated versions of the Bible. The photographs from that occasion, which are on our website, are frightening, with an inevitable choreography that seems eerily reminiscent of scenes from Europe in the 1930s. So, it can't happen here, eh? For about 6 years now, I've been running the Free Speech Project at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C., as Leanne mentioned. It's an attempt to measure the various threats to free expression in American education, civil society, and government at all levels. Our website went online in the fall of 2017 with a dozen or so carefully researched and crafted memos on our free speech tracker summarizing problematic incidents around the country. Just a few. In the next few weeks, we will speed past 900 episodes on the Free Speech Tracker, covering large issues and seemingly minor ones in big cities and small towns, affecting people of all ages and walks of life all around the United States. We've also produced curriculum modules for use in college and high school classes, orientation programs and community conversations, plus periodic newsletters with student analyses of free speech issues, and we do public programs both in person and virtual. Thousands of people now watch these programs every month on Zoom or YouTube. Embarrassingly enough, this is a booming business, and a grim one too. It's hard not to conclude that our democracy is in serious danger. I taunt myself now and again to try to decide what is really the worst problem we're examining, the most worrisome threat to free expression and independent thought. There's plenty of competition for this dubious honor, I assure you, but I keep returning to censorship, book banning, and a host of related issues, including telling teachers what they may teach, librarians what books they may collect, and the general public increasingly how they should think and talk and lead their lives. Some of you are surely tempted to believe that I'm exaggerating, making a mountain out of a molehill, as my mother used to say. Well, consider this. Just the other day, the governor of Arkansas, in her wisdom, issued an executive order with a list of words and terms the people of her state are not supposed to use. It was bound to come, and it will spread, I guarantee you. PEN America, the U.S. branch of an international organization that defends writers, found recently that during the 2022-23 school year, there were 3,362 instances of book bans in this country. One school year, 3,362 instances of book bans or restrictions in this country, an increase of 1/3 over the year before. In that same survey, released just a month ago, PEN discovered that the number of books permanently removed, not just taking time out or moved to a different shelf, permanently removed from U.S. school libraries and classrooms, seemingly never to return, had quadrupled to 1,263. Imagine the height of that pile of books permanently removed from our school libraries. Perhaps not surprisingly, the number of school book bans, the largest number of school book bans occurred in Florida. But close behind were Texas, Missouri, Utah, and my home state of Pennsylvania. The overall numbers are startling, but some of the individual incidents that can be followed on our free speech tracker make the point even more dramatically. And so I thought I'd just quickly summarize a few of them. The school board in Wisconsin ruled that a student may not have access to a nonfiction book documenting the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II. Too dangerous. In Tennessee, Maus, M-A-U-S, a famous and celebrated graphic novel about the Holocaust, is banished. In Michigan, Spanish and Swahili dictionaries are removed from the prison system. Too dangerous. A Texas legislator boasts that he has a personal list of 850 books he's working on going after. A whole new generation of math textbooks intended for use in Florida's public schools has been set aside because its word problems, we all remember word problems, its word problems introduce prohibited topics that disturb the governor. In Iowa and some other states, some libraries just shut down rather than keep trying to resolve some of these issues. And it's not only on the outskirts of Nashville that book burnings have occurred. A group of college students in Georgia publicly set fire to the books written by an author visiting their campus. They did not approve of her message. And they laughed at the fun of it all. The QAnon conspiracy group has also instigated book burnings, especially at churches. But it's often difficult to keep track of such episodes of book burnings, if only because many people, thankfully, are understandably embarrassed to acknowledge that they've taken place in their communities. Where does all this come from, and where will it lead? It is really much more ubiquitous than most people imagine. It's clear that many book bannings result from pressure campaigns, often by parents, hence our title this evening. Those are not so hard to track. I spend a fair amount of time up in Pennsylvania near Gettysburg. This is a copy of the Gettysburg Times, the local newspaper. You can't see it from here, but I'll be glad to show it to anybody later. It happens to be from a year ago this week, and the lead story is about a parent. It says LASD, that's Littlestown Area School District, just near Gettysburg. LASD parent again complains about library books. So this is happening not just in certain places that get a great deal of attention, but all over the place. And it's gotten so common that it's not even tracked that carefully anymore. In many states, this pressure is now deeply embedded in local politics. Indeed, It's widely accepted that the current governor of Virginia, Glenn Youngkin, swept into office in 2021 partially on the strength of this particular branch of the culture wars. He made an issue book by book over elements of the public school curriculum that were brought to his attention by angry parents. A little side note about Governor Youngkin is that his own children attended a private school in Washington, D.C., where the curriculum was exactly the same. Many of these same books were taught, and he doesn't even recognize the irony of that his own children were educated with books that he has now participated in banning from the public schools of Virginia. One mother in Spotsylvania County in northern Virginia, Jennifer Peterson by name, who was featured last month in the Washington Post, challenges one school book every week that she says depicts sexual acts. She keeps 73 of those books as trophies in her basement as she works over her list. Every week, a book to ban. One perplexing question, and I'm going to be brief here because I want to leave plenty of time for our discussion with our well-qualified panel. One perplexing question is whether the parents behind this movement, and it's an increasingly organized movement, organizations with benign names like Moms for Liberty, whether this movement, or at least some percentage of those parents, are genuinely well-intentioned and can claim credit in any sense for performing a public service. And I think that's something we all have to reckon with, whether they have some nobility on their side somehow, or they can defend themselves in some way, because we have to deal with this. The PEN America study I referenced earlier noted that almost half the books banned during the last school year included accounts of violence and physical abuse, including sexual assault. Those are not good things to read about, but they come along with the territory of literature. A third of the books had themes related to LGBTQ+ identities, and a similar percentage had characters of color and themes of race or racism. I spent a lot of time wondering how the people behind this movement justify and explain themselves. And I really find it's very difficult to give them any of the compliments they're seeking for attacking the lifestyle decisions of people of any age, or to ascribe their assaults on history and truth to anything but racism and white supremacy. And we've, I think, recognized a long time ago, fought a civil war over white supremacy. And, you know, there are signs around Gettysburg. As I said, I spend a fair amount of time in that area. There's signs around Gettysburg that say, this war was fought because Black Lives Matter, to tie an old point, painful point in American history to a current theme. So I think there are some soft issues we have to consider around this problem that we're confronting. It is a national problem. What is going to be the long-term effect of these book bans and these book burnings? Are they going to hinder curiosity, speech, and expression? Will there actually be a generation of children who have been prevented from reading about, learning about ideas that are going to be present in their daily lives? This is not going to make those issues go away. And how will we help that generation make up for what they've missed? What might be some of the other consequences? Might Americans be at a disadvantage around the world because boundaries have been drawn? Might they be at a disadvantage for hiring in jobs in many different fields where there's international competition because their education has been suddenly politically warped? Can our citizens compete if they lack exposure to some of the great literature of our country? Can they, if they haven't had access to what's really going on and what's being talked about? One of the books that I'm perpetually shocked to hear is on many of these lists is To Kill a Mockingbird. And I don't know, there's been, in recent years, there's been a theater production of To Kill a Mockingbird. And it's an extraordinary piece of theater. It really teaches us a great deal about our own past in this country. And of course, every country has to examine its past. You can't say that awkward issues in our past are suddenly taboo for discussion. And I would prescribe To Kill a Mockingbird to be seen by every single person who's involved in banning books, and ask them to confront and explain the reasons why those ideas are now taboo. I'm going to stop there so that Leanne can introduce our other panelists and we can have further discussion of these issues. Thank you.
Getting our evening started. I realized when he started talking that I didn't introduce myself. My name is Leanne Howard, and I'm the chair of the Communication and Media Department. There we go. I want to introduce our panelists. Our first panelist to come is Mr. Scott Kinney, and he is the CEO and director of the Evansville Vanderburgh Public Library. With more than 30 years experience in libraries, Mr. Kinney has previously served as the director of the Mobile Public Library in Alabama and as director of the Sweetwater County Library System in Green River, Wyoming. Kinney is passionate about public libraries and about its community. He continually collaborates with his staff and those they serve to discover what the library means to them and how he and the library can continue supporting the community as it grows and thrives. Our next panelist is Dr. Chad Tu. Dr. Tu is an associate professor of journalism at the University of Southern Indiana. His research interests include media ethics and new technologies. His publications include an analysis of the Palestinian experience in Joe Sacco's graphic novel and examination of family ties and new digital technologies, and a study of fake news as media criticism. And our last but not least panelist is Dr. Elizabeth Wilkins, an assistant professor at the University of Southern Indiana in teacher education. Her scholarship revolves around creating spaces of success for all students and course topics including equity, culturally relevant pedagogy, and instructional literacy practices focusing on English language learners and students with exceptionalities. So, let's get started. The American Library Association has described a range of book restrictions, from a challenge, defined as an attempt to remove or restrict materials based upon the objections of a person or a group, to the more widely used banning, which refers to the removal of those materials. Can one of you talk about the range of restrictions and how they might impact communities?
Sure. On the public library level, what libraries are facing is we do have reconsideration forms that the public will fill out to request a material to be either removed from the library, but most cases they would like it to be moved within the library, which is a different form of censorship, to where that material is not in the location where the author wanted it to be for its intended audience. So we have a lot of teen materials and children's materials that some people feel should be in the adult collection, but the author who wrote those pieces wrote it for that intended audience to either read a children's book or a teen material. So that's really what public libraries are facing, as well as school libraries, is the intended wishes of the authors and the publishing world of where those materials should be housed in its intended audience.
Does anyone else like to comment on that?
Sure. So we've already mentioned the Penn study from 22. So actually, as a teacher, you always have your resources. And so thinking about why people are challenging books, there are several reasons. And I think it's important for us to kind of contextualize why topic matter is being censored, is being removed from kids and access that we can all benefit from. So first is instances of violence and physical abuse. And think about the experiences of children, young adults. These are themes that they're going to see themselves in, reflect on, have empathy for. Topics on mental health. Why would we want to ban topics on mental health when we know the current state of our youth post-pandemic? When we know the state of our university students post-pandemic? It's intentional, right? Themes of grief and death. Why would we ban those topics, right? It boils down to empathy. It boils down to caring. LGBTQ plus characters or themes. When we ban books that have queer characters in it, that negatively affects our students that may be in that community. So why are we doing it? Empathy, or lack thereof. When we think about teen pregnancy, we think about the abortion bans, we think about sexual assaults. We don't want kids reading about that, but the reality is our students experience these things. And so when we remove access to these books, these topics, what does that leave us with? It's empty. Kids don't know how to navigate these topics. They don't know how to connect to characters. And then ultimately don't know how to connect with each other. So really kind of engaging with, why are we banning it? Well, think critically, because it's intentional. So school officials are tasked with creating places where students can learn, comfortable environments, climates that encourage learning. Other than empathy, can you give us a few more examples about the ways in which a book ban debate might be having an impact on education?
Definitely. So I brought a book that actually got me kicked out of the state of Oklahoma. So I was a 10-year teacher. I taught 6th grade in urban Oklahoma City. And in 2021, our governor passed House Bill 1775, which prohibited the discussion of race, specifically race, and actually had a fine attached to teachers who engaged in race conversation. Now, for those of you who don't know, Oklahoma has a pretty sordid history. Initially, Indian territory, and then the Sooners moved in, stole land, and then towns flourished. Tulsa, heard of the Tulsa Race Massacre? Tulsa Race Riot, right? This book, it's called Dreamland Burning, is a historical fiction that has characters who are biracial, investigating the KKK in 1920 Oklahoma. And so I had 4 parents who came forward really uncomfortable with the historical aspects of this book, right? And so once again, like, we're not talking about history, things that actually happened. Names of people, one of my classroom assignments was every real person we documented. Every real place we documented. The Dreamland Theater, which this book is titled after, was a real theater that was burned to the ground by white supremacist KKK members, which were flourishing in 1920s Oklahoma. And so when we take away history, once again, what are we left with? What are kids lacking? That critical thought, right? The understanding of their own history living in Oklahoma or in states like Oklahoma.
So the American Library Association reports that most challenges to books involve multiple titles. So people are putting together a challenge for 25 books at once, or 50 books at once, or 100 books for once, whereas in the past, if a book was challenged, it might be a single title. I guess I would be interested to know, I was surprised to hear that Diary of Anne Frank is one of the books. What are some of the titles that are being banned, whether they be classic or contemporary, that people might be surprised by? Anybody?
Sure. Catcher in the Rye is always on the ban list. Let's see. I've seen the Bible on the ban list. I've seen Steinbeck on the banned list, Mice and Men, Fault of the Stars, Indiana State Book has been on the banned list. So we could go on and on. ALA publishes an exhaustive list of all the materials that have been banned, but those are just some that are there.
Anybody just want to jump into some others that you know about? Harry Potter is one, 1984 was one.
Slaughterhouse-Five. I brought a book tonight, All Boys Aren't Blue by George M. Johnson, The Hate You Kids.
The Lorax.
1984, Fahrenheit 451.
Dr. Seuss.
Yes.
It was challenged in 1989 and 2012 because California was upset it talked about logging, which was the major export at the time.
I'm sorry. So why now? Why so many now? What's different, I guess, about what happened in the past and what we're currently seeing about book bans and debates and restrictions and censorship and so on? What's different now? Is anything different now?
Yeah, and I think one thing that's different is that this is part of a national political movement. It's not just banning books, it's attacking school curricula, some of the other things that we deal with at the Free Speech Project and on our website that are linked to each other. And I think, you know, what's always interesting is when these things occur in state legislatures and bills are proposed that have the exact same language from one state to another. There are many examples of that today. So it's clearly an organized movement. There are some so-called think tanks. I don't know if they should be called think tanks in this case or dumb tanks, but there are some places that churn this stuff out. And so I think it's a more organized movement. You know, it used to be quaint that certain books and movies were so-called banned in Boston. And there were some public trials and it was a very dramatic thing, but you couldn't count the number of these things taking place right now. And I think it is largely a part of the culture wars and being exploited for political purposes. And I think a lot of political candidates think this is the way to please parents, to ban books.
So the sort of political context, culture wars. Are there other ideas that might explain what's going on now?
Sure. I would probably say the internet and the 24-second news cycle has done that. Social media, it's easier to get information on a particular viewpoint out there and get a large audience. And very little vetting is done with the information because the information is put out there so quickly. I think that has a cause and effect to why so many bans are out there, just because you see it out there and you take it as an authoritative source because, hey, they wouldn't put it out on the internet if it wasn't accurate, which obviously isn't true. And people believe it. And people want to believe like-minded and be part of something. So I think it's partly due to somewhat of the social media. Not that social media doesn't have its place in our society, it obviously does. It's a great way to connect with people, but it also can be misused as well.
Yeah, I think part of it too has to, like Sandy said, it has to do a lot with political polarization that is happening and killing us by 1,000 cuts, right? You know, it just keeps coming back and with a lot of issues, but this one in particular. And also the radicalization of so many people. And again, there we get into social media, where people get into these echo chambers, and they also can use those tools also to organize politically. And this is a very well connected network of people we're talking about. When we get into some of these groups like Moms for Liberty and some of the politicians that they are interacting with and some of the other groups that they're interacting with. But this radicalization of America is another thing.
So laws usually stipulate that a restricted or banned book is in some way harmful to minors, and Dr. Wilkins talked a little bit about what that might mean: mental health, sexual content, profanity. But a lot of the books in question are not about sex or violence, but they're about race or LGBTQ plus themes. How are these being interpreted as harmful to minors? And I guess I'm kind of curious about what conclusions we might draw seeing these on these kinds of lists.
So thinking about, okay, so for example, you know, I teach children's lit. I was a 6th grade teacher forever. When we had books that had a family member with, you know, 2 dads, that was a contentious topic, and I think it's because of exposure, right? And my mom always had the phrase, all you touch and all you see is all that you will ever be, right? So if we're not exposing kids to people, the human experience, they're going to fear the other. And I think that's part of that radicalization. We have othered these experiences of people of color. We have othered the experiences of historical truth instead of, you know, relying on some fake news. And like, I always come back to empathy. My goal when I teach, when I read, is to have a connection, to feel, to imagine. And if we remove those opportunities, we're not going to have kids who think. We're not going to have engagement. We're not going to have social action. The Hunger Games is a banned book, a challenged book across our country. Why? Government. You know, she overthrew the government. Why wouldn't we want kids reading about that? It's intentional, right? It proves that it can be done, that there are problems that we need to solve as Americans, as human beings living in this country, living on this planet. And not having these discussions allows it to continue, to flourish.
No, you're reading the whole book, though. See, and I think one thing you got to understand here is when people go to school board meetings and they try to ban these books, they haven't read most of those books, or any of them. What they do is, there's a website called booklooks.org by a former member of Moms for Liberty, and it basically has excerpts. So what they do is they stand up at a meeting and they will read just a small little excerpt of a book like this, and they'll read the most controversial part, hoping to shock the audience there. And that's how they work all across the country. They've been working like this. So they're not reading the whole book in its totality and trying to understand and become empathetic towards others. It's just part of a radicalization. It's a tactic to use, and it's trying to shock people. It's building up a hysteria that is part of that political polarization.
So I'm going to turn this conversation on its end a little bit. To ask you, do the kinds of books being banned, for whatever reason, do they negatively impact students, or are there books that we should ban?
Well, I have to say, I think it would be very difficult. I don't know how research could be produced that would show that a series of books definitely or are suspected of doing harm to children. You know, this has been said about music, it's been said about art, contemporary art, modern art is thought to be degenerate for a long time. Music, movies, you know, we might not choose to listen to some of this music. We might not choose to go to certain museums or to watch certain movies. But to be told you can't do it is a very, very big step in cutting back on people's... I mean, it's an irony that it's Moms for Liberty who sort of act against liberty, against fundamental liberty to read, liberty to think about it in the way we want to. I would find that research very difficult to accept, I must say.
And in my experience, I started working in libraries back in 1984, became a professional librarian in 1997. I have never had a child come up and actually say that anything that they read had harmed them. I've seen children testify in different states, including this one, before our legislature saying that this has happened to them and this caused them to do this, but I've never personally had that happen. But I've had many a child come to me saying, by reading this book, it identified something that I was wondering about myself, and it helped me understand myself. So I've had that happen numerous occasions. I know on my staff at all the libraries I've worked with across the country have had similar experience, and my colleagues across the country, but I have never seen any research or literature that has definitively shown that as well. That's just my own personal experience.
George Johnson, who wrote this book, again, All Boys Aren't Blue, he actually addresses this in the opening of his book. And so in his own words, the author's note, I'll just read a small excerpt here. He's explaining why, you know, with all the controversy around his book, why he wanted to write it. In writing this book, I wanted to be as authentic and truthful about my experience as possible. I wanted my story to be told in totality, the good, the bad, and the things that I was always too afraid to talk about publicly. This meant going to places and discussing some subjects that are often kept away from teens for fear of them being too heavy. But the truth of the matter is, these things happened to me when I was a child, teenager, and young adult. So as heavy as these subjects may be, it is necessary that they are not only told, but also read by teens who may have to navigate many of these same experiences in their own lives. And so I think that's a personal testimony to exactly what you're saying.
So a recent NPR ISOS poll revealed that 75% of the parents trust teachers about the curriculum, and 65% of the parents opposed book bans by school boards, and 69% of them opposed bans by lawmakers. Yet PEN America, and we heard Mr. Ungar talk a little bit about this in the last year, book bans and restrictions have gone up 33% with 33 states, including Indiana, enacting or introducing legislation about reading materials. If you had to summarize like why this is such a hot debate, what would you say?
You know, I think it's an attractive topic politically in this time of polarization. And if you can, if you're upset with some of the changes in this country in the last 10, 20 years, until very recently, it's nice to have somebody to blame. It's nice to be able to say that people were being, quote unquote, groomed for certain behavior. And a totally absurd word to use for what's going on. And it's much harder to organize against this phenomenon than it is to jump on the bandwagon and make claims that are absolutely impossible to prove but are politically popular.
Yeah, I think, well, one other thing on that is I think that another flip side of that is people are against the banning of books, the majority of people, and yet the other flip side of the public view is that faith in our institutions is as low as they've ever been. Now, when, like for instance, you know, the Gallup polls have been testing this for a long time, and they take about 16 different categories. And since the pandemic, those numbers have fallen. Our faith in institutions such as the presidency, and on, Congress, Supreme Court, but even libraries, and education. Education is one of those institutions. Our faith in education has sunk really low. It's, I think, in the 23 zone, but it's fallen to its lowest. So radicals, they want to exploit weakness. If the vast amount of people don't have faith in our public institutions, radicals will go and try to exploit that. So they're basically feeding off of our own society's weakness.
So lawmakers such as Indiana Senator Jim Thomas of Wadesville argue that Indiana's recently passed House Bill 1447 requires school librarians to be transparent about their collection and to provide information to parents about the books their child has access to. How might this bill impact the way that books are reviewed by teachers and school officials and librarians in terms of the collection, either for their curriculum or their curriculum or the collection in their school?
I can start this off. State standards in Indiana for public libraries, at least, and school libraries as part of the Indiana Library Federation, they're members of that as well, adhere to standards where we've always had a collection development policies that can be reviewed. They're on almost every school corporation. Every public library has it, and it's a state standard that we have one. We have always been transparent and had reconsideration forms. This is nothing new that this law has implemented. It's basically just codified it, that it was there, but it was already part of the state library standards, at least for public libraries. So it's been there already, but what it's done is it's put it in another piece of the law. But at the school library level, it's a little bit different because when that law passed, it took the educational defense away from school library media specialists and teachers. And what that means is it took one defense away from them if they should be sued or for having these materials in their library. So what it's essentially done is it's unnerved those professionals who are trying to do all those things that you talked about, being altruistic and empathetic and providing information that people will understand, and made them apprehensive of possibly keeping that in their collections for fear of reprisals.
Yeah. This law is going to go into effect January 1st, 2024. And it basically targets, like you said, it removes educational value as an excuse that people can use to keep that book in the library. However, it uses the obscenity laws that are standard on the books.
Mm-hmm.
So all of those books with literary, artistic, political, or scientific value, that still remains a standard. Okay, so it's really just removed the educational value, but it is very punitive against our school librarians.
Mm-hmm.
We're talking, if a librarian were to have a book that was on the shelf and it was deemed to be one of these violating books, that librarian could face 6 months to 2.5 years in prison and $10,000. That is shocking. That we would actually do that to people who are trying to enlighten our children, awaken their spirit in reading. And it also is problematic in Indiana for a lot of other reasons. I mean, we already have teacher shortages. We've had trouble with retention for many years now. And so does this not just, ruin the morale even more? Jim Thomas, who is a local state senator, he's in this area, Posey County, Vanderburgh County. Anybody who's in the state Senate seat, District 49, he would be your representative. He actually said in an interview, he said, "I want there to be a chilling effect." It's a representative that is leading this this issue of these most radical, with this most radical right agenda and he's kind of leading this charge with
So I want to kind of go back to the original question for a moment. I have to confess that when I read information about the bill, I was really surprised that educational value was not a factor for a school. And it led me to wonder, well, what is? So could you talk maybe about the standards or what it is that would be an acceptable evaluative, to use a university word, metric for assessing books and their viability for a collection? So what do you judge them on, if not educational value in the context of a school?
So state standards have very specific guidelines. You need to have nonfiction, fiction, historical fiction present in your library. So one of the things I would do if I was a teacher in Indiana at this point is I would argue that this book actually has a ton of value. Now, is it going to talk about the KKK? Yes, it is. Is it going to talk about some of the problems that existed for biracial people in the 1920s? Absolutely. But I would argue that that's part of history. Indiana history is taught. It has to be taught. It's a state standard. But what we're seeing are those science class times are being eradicated. Now, if you're in elementary school and if you're a mother or if you love children, look at the elementary school schedules because you're going to see those social studies, they're gone, right? Science, they're gone. And instead we're getting lots of rote, kind of memorized material. Indiana's passing a new law. It'll take effect actually this July for the science of reading, which I love. It's phonetics, it's, you know, it's great. But that's what we're really focusing on here is we're removing the literature out of classrooms and instead giving, you know, really short little, you know, 3-paragraph worksheets. And so you'll see in our classrooms this removal. Kids aren't going to be reading books. They're going to be reading on iLearn, IXL every single morning. There's not going to be books present that actually give them that critical thought. And so when I look at, you know, classroom libraries, my first, I actually use a Scholastic inventory sheet from one of my master's classes that I teach. And it asks about Indigenous authors, Black authors. Do you have main characters with these, you know, kind of criterions? And what we're seeing is that it's not there. And we're looking for worksheets. We're looking for scripted curriculum. That is what's replacing our classroom libraries at this point. And so you are going to see beautiful books disappear. Our kids are not going to be reading 400-page books in middle school and high school. If there even are libraries that have books like this at all. And so it's really important for us as people with agency to have these discussions, to write our representatives, because if they laugh at this, it's going to be a reality in Posey and Vanderburgh County. So I would say that the whole shift is more towards like very rote worksheet, short, multiple choice answer questions, because it removes that critical thought, it removes that empathy, and it removes that social connection to what makes us all human at our core.
So I have a couple of other perspectives and topics I want to get to, but this may be a question, again, for you, Dr. Wilkins, but anyone can answer. Briefly, can you talk about how you determine what's age appropriate for a child? Again, honestly, I was probably reading stuff I shouldn't have, but you read what you read, and my parents wanted us to read, and they didn't really care so much about what we did. I mean, how do you determine, when is it a child, when can they determine what's appropriate? Can you talk about that a little bit?
So research says 2nd grade. By 2nd grade, kids can identify books that are easy enough for them to read. There's no frustration level, right? There's no problem with like the actual reading process. But by 2nd grade, they have a picture, a movie in their head, which is a skill that not every person has. If you're not a lover of reading, think about that movie in your head. So by 2nd grade, that skill is developed. Now, my argument would be, kids are going to come with all varied lived experiences. What books I like to read might not be really popular with my students. And so student choice was a huge factor for me when I was a teacher. We had book clubs, so kids would know their reading level, and they would have 10 books to choose from. And I ran this program from 4th to 12th grade. So that was how we kind of did our literacy and reading time. And what we saw was that kids would choose books and they would fall in love. And teachers would host these books, and we would actually teach it like it was a class. and we made it loved, and it was this beautiful moment. So really, it comes down to what are kids interested in. If a second grader wants to read a book about, you know, maybe Diary of a Wimpy Kid, that's a challenged book, by the way. Think about that, because it has, what's the word? It doesn't listen to his mother or father, right? It challenges authority, right? Things like that. If a second grader wants to read that book, let them. And if I have 3-year-old twins, and if we're going to start reading books, probably in the next year, and are they going to understand every single word or every single concept? Are they going to have a picture in their head? Absolutely not. But we're going to talk like I would if I was a teacher, or like I would if I was in a book club with adults, because kids have to be exposed. And so I would argue that there isn't really a criterion for like what kids want to read. Kids just need access. And adults need access to varied type of reading materials.
And I would go so far as to say the shoe's on the wrong foot. Why should a librarian, be it a school librarian or a public librarian, have to justify each book that she or he brings into the collection? I think that's a terrible burden and forces people to make some very strange, artificial judgments. It seems to me that the whole purpose of literature is to expose people to new things, experimental things. Yes, occasionally risky things. Life is full of risks. The reality we live in is full of dangerous things that happen. If our literature doesn't project the reality around us, it's going to be rejected.
So for the sake of time, I'm going to do what I teach my students not to do, to ask 2 questions at once, double-barreled question. So why shouldn't parents have the right to determine what their child reads? And then the second part of that is why are parents' rights of lesser importance than the First Amendment and freedom of speech?
I think we both agree on it. We were talking about this earlier. We're both fans of what's called parental mediation. And in parental mediation, you know, there are different styles of parenting. There are some parents who say are, let's say, laissez-faire. Some parents who have a lot of restrictions. There are some parents who do experience some media with their children, but there's not much conversation going on. And then probably the most prized form of this parenting with media is to sit down with your child, experience that media, and then talk to your child about these issues. And talk to them at their level, because that's what they understand. So I was sharing with Elizabeth here the story of my daughter, who at the time was in 4th grade. The big movie was Napoleon Dynamite. And that like, oh, maybe that's not appropriate for a 4th grader. But we watched it anyway. Her peers were watching that film at the time. And we had this discussion about it afterwards. And there were some scenes that I thought were, oh my gosh, you know, I thought it was a little weird. But when I asked my daughter about these things, they just went right over her head. She didn't really even think about these.
Sorry.
Yeah,
I think that, you know, as parents, as teachers, we have to we have to train our parents, right? Parents don't know how to ask questions to their children, really. So like when we read a book with our children, are you pausing? If you look at my teacher, I call this teacher homework, like I have sticky notes of like questions that I would literally write down to prepare for the classes that I would teach. Parents don't do that, right? We don't pause, we don't check for comprehension, right? And that's part of that reading process, and that's part of that connection. So one of the things our school did when we had our book clubs is we invited parents. Parents were very aware of the books that we were providing for our book club. Parents could come in, we provided literacy classes, parenting classes for them, because what we saw was our parents didn't know what they didn't know. And that helped kind of create that relationship again with the school, right? I wanted parents to trust me. I wanted kids to talk to their families. And I wanted there to be this like equal partnership. And I feel like that's something that's missing, is this partnership quality. where it's like we're against parents and parents are against the schools, but where's the kid, right? Just caught in the middle. And are they being cared for, like the true notion of care? So as, you know, as future teachers or, you know, future parents or future uncles or aunts, like we really have to take responsibility and create the time for conversation. Because I guarantee you, if you were to sit down and read together and discuss, and is that really time consuming? Yeah, but guess what? Your kid's reading, and so are you. That relationship and that understanding and that empathy and that critical thought is going to come through.
As we were discussing, this is a much richer experience for the child
Right.
when they do have that parent-child connection over some form of media, even a book or television show. Whatever.
In the public library environment, we always encourage the parent to be there for their child when they're selecting materials that they're reading, to be present for them. You know, when we do story times at the public library, our staff are trained how to read a story and ask questions as they're reading to challenge and enrich the storytelling with the child. And that's done also to model behavior for the parents that are attending the story times with their child, to help them learn how to read to their child. So these are things that we try and do, is model behavior that parents can see. We have parents who come to our story times who have that camaraderie and talk about how to read to their child. And that's one thing that public libraries really try and do, is make sure that parents are there for their child. And of course, we want them to come to the library with their child if they have any concerns about what their child will read.
Then returning to your question about the First Amendment versus parents, that's a really important question. First of all, I think one of the central things to get out of this when it comes to the First Amendment, it is about the rights of authors, it is about the rights of publishers, it is about the rights of readers, and in the library setting as well. But it's the right to receive. That is the most important thing going on here. Now, that's not verbally in the First Amendment text, but it undergirds the entire thing. Because if you cannot receive information, then you can't speak freely, you can't carry on rational conversations about topics with people and have a reasonable conversation in a public forum. So it's that right to receive. That's central concept with the library system, that librarians make these books available, all of us, because it's a public forum in a way. It's a place of intellectual inquiry. It's a place where we should be able to go and receive all kinds of information, even if some of us find some of the material objectionable.
So we've talked about book banning in terms of political assault, polarization, fearful of what to read, what you can't read, and who can make these decisions. We talked about parental sort of mediation as a kind of alternative perhaps to book banning. Are there other alternatives or strategies that you can think of that can help us achieve a middle ground to sort of respect the rights of all, or maybe as many people as possible?
Leanne, I think that's a very important question. And I would hope that we would all aspire to be able to open a dialogue with people who are trying to restrict information access. I mean, I think that Chad defines this very well. That's what the First Amendment is intended to guarantee. And I'm very troubled by this notion of parental rights. I mean, I introduced the term into the discussion too, but as if they're in competition with the rights of everybody else. And one of the worries I have is that how long do these parental rights prevail? Up to what age? What circumstance? When do the children suddenly get released to make their own decisions? And what is it too late to have access to, or too late to understand? But I think in this era, it's very hard to find reasonable interlocutors on some of these issues. You're either with them or you're against them. And the notion that a large number of people are now defining the First Amendment as being, and there's even a member of the Supreme Court who has said in a dissenting or concurring opinion, it's time to re-examine the First Amendment and what it's doing to our society. We're really in trouble if that's the case.
Anybody else have an idea about alternatives or middle ground that we might reach?
Well, middle ground. Okay, middle ground. I'll go with there because I think activism on the other side is important. I think, you know, if there is activism to try to pull books off of shelves, I think there needs to be some activism on the other side that protects librarians, protects schools, protects books. But in terms of the middle ground, I think what you've already said is that the public library system does have these implementation systems, is what they're called, you know, where you can go and challenge something. Those are there. So, I mean, that is part of the middle ground already exists. Librarians are already transparent and open. And another thing is we treat books differently than we treat other media. So we're very comfortable with the FCC regulating radio and television. We're very comfortable with the self-regulation of movies to have rating systems, video games to have rating systems, music to tell us what's explicit and what's not. If book publishers are threatened too much by federal regulation, it may be some kind of self-preservation that they're going to have to do in order to have a rating system of their own. But that could be costly. I'm not sure what that would do to libraries, if that would shake things.
I think it would be problematic in a public library setting just because of the nature of shelving. Right now, we already do the best we can to self-police by having juvenile collections, teen collections, adult collections, having genres split out by, mystery, fiction, faith fiction, westerns. We try and do all those things to make things convenient, to be easily accessible to the patrons who want to read those materials. And when you start adding ratings into them, it gets confusing. I know I have a number of staff out here. Probably when we get a challenge at the library in most recent years, it's generally not a print media, it's an audiovisual item, and it's typically a movie. And most times it's a non-rated movie, so it's a foreign film or an independent film that doesn't go through the scrutiny of the rating system here in the United States. And we do our best to put an extra label on there that content may not be appropriate for all, or some language my staff that are here in the audience could probably read that to you directly. But we do our best as public libraries across the country to do that, to make sure we're doing an honest job, the best job we can to police those types of items.
There's a lurking threat, Leanne, that for some publishers, the costs, the risks of publishing some books are just going to get too high. And these people will succeed in some cases without even trying, just to raise the specter, to raise the threat. There's so many books that don't sell a lot of copies and that frankly depend upon library sales to justify their publication, as I'm sure Scott knows.
Yes.
And what are we going to lose?
A recent ABC News report discussed that students are actually pushing back, that many high school students have organized banned book clubs that center around reading banned books. I just found out as I was talking to some people in the audience that Brothers Bookstore actually has a book club on banned books if you have interest. Other libraries and schools may have something similar. But students felt that they were being left out of this discussion and that bans are, quote, hiding the truth about the world we need to know. So I guess my last question, and we have time for one question from the audience if we want to go there. What can people do if they are concerned about banning books?
Honestly, I'll go first. As our panelists here said, be activists. If you're against book banning, obviously vote. Know who you're voting for, what they stand for. Obviously, legislation gets passed at both the state and federal level by who we vote for. So do your diligence and pick the people that you feel are appropriate by your choice of who you want to represent you. Go to meetings, become involved in your community, get on boards, get on your local library board, your other local nonprofit boards to help share this message and have basically that counterbalance as we were talking to about earlier, to make sure that with this coordinated effort that is out there to ban books and restrict the freedom to read, make sure that we have enough people out there on the opposite side to express their feelings that it's very important to them as well.
School board races are very important, especially with this issue, but also, the state senator and the state house representatives, hold them accountable. If they're voting for these kinds of things that you don't like, hold them accountable at the polling station.
Well, I want to second that. I lived in Washington for many decades, and I'm a victim to some extent of the Washington feeling that things happening in that city are really what shapes the American experience. But doing this free speech project, studying the challenges to free expression in the United States, has convinced me that the votes on the local level are actually far more significant. The decisions on local level, like these, there are very few decisions made at the federal level about banning books. There may be a few examples, but it's really at the local level. It's in the community. And I think the book banners have to be engaged in conversations at the community level and confronted and not allowed to bully teachers, librarians, school boards. I mean, this is just a symptom of many things. There are school boards around this country now and county councils, city councils that are passing rules that say anyone can speak at a meeting, but you can't criticize us. Well, what's going to happen to democracy in the long term?
My advice would be to read it anyway. So if you're conflicted, read it. And as you're reading, if things make you uncomfortable, reflect on why. Why do I feel weird about talking about white supremacy and the KKK? Maybe there are biases that I have yet to unpack. And that's a conversation that has to happen, right? And sometimes we become, discomforted, and we decline, and we refuse, or we get defensive. But books are art, and art imitates life, and we have to engage with life.
Right.
And so my advice would be, if you look at the list, I would Google Evansville, top 20 banned books or the whole list, read one of them, and then really sit with, why are people upset? Am I upset? What about this makes me feel uncomfortable? And have that kind of internal reflection. Because that's how we grow, and that's how we connect, and that's how we truly develop empathy and understanding of others.
Thank you. So we do have time for one question. If anyone has a burning question, we have a mic down here that you can come down and, or maybe say it from where you're sitting. Yeah.
Can I just say it before I ask?
That's a lot of pressure.
So I'm asking this question because I worry about this objection, right? I want you to know I'm on your side. I'm totally with you. I've lobbied tomes in person, all right? I'm not opposed, right? But this is the worry that I have. The reason books are getting banned at record levels is we live in an attention economy. A book is too big, requires too much focus. You live in the past. Books aren't power. Knowledge isn't power. Power is repetition. Power is emotion. Power is attention. You're just mad that you're losing political power. It's like, this isn't the world anymore. The way you get power isn't with books, isn't with evidence, isn't with knowledge, isn't with dialogue. Bullying is the future. Tell me why I'm wrong.
Okay, I'm going to read you something. All right. So this was a book, Divergent. If you've read it, it's excellent. Don't read the third one. It's sad. All right. In chapter 21, I have a dog-eared, right? This book is not banned or challenged because of the violence, the death, the murder, any of that. It is banned because of this paragraph. And it is because the main character, spoiler alert, her name's Tris, is abducted in the night and is almost murdered, right? And this is a heavy, and I'm very transparent with parents. This is what's going to happen in chapter 21 on page 278. And I read this, right? The hands force my back to the arch over the railing. My feet leave the ground and my attackers are the only thing keeping me from falling into the water. A heavy hand gropes along my chest. You sure you're 16, stiff? Doesn't feel like you're more than 12. The other boys laugh. I stop, and we talk about that. And my 11-year-old girls in my book club whisper to each other. And as a teacher, your red flag comes up. And one of the girls says, that's happened to me. That's power, right? So not only did we talk about violence, assault, how this is wrong, but the empowerment of realizing that this has happened to me and that this is wrong. And that's the magic of books. It's not intentional, right? The author did not write this book and say, I'm going to put that in there for empowerment, but that's what it is. And so when my students read that, and we stop and we talk, and they sit there and they're like, that has happened to me, and that's not okay. That's healing. And that's why I think books are magic.
Could we please give a round of applause to the entire panel? I also want to take this opportunity to thank you for coming to this event. As I said at the beginning, it's incredibly important, and it's very heartening to see so many people here and interested in this, to be redundant, really important issue. There are a lot of people that made this event possible, and I don't want us to leave without taking the opportunity to thank all the people who have been instrumental in bringing the event to you. Certainly the College of Liberal Arts, our Department of Communication and Media, the Rice Library, and the University Foundation providing the funding for the program. I'd also like to thank in the College of Liberal Arts, Shari Berger, who has been a marketer extraordinaire to get the word out. Clearly successful with the number of people that we had. I'd also like to thank the other deans and administrative staff who are always superb in helping us do things. At the Rice Library, we have Marna Hostetler, who was a very important person helping get this organized. She was one of the first people I talked to when this topic came up, and she was like, yes, I'm there. And that was like, woo, yay, let's do it. So that was super. In my own department, Jane Weathered, Elvis Montana-Rivas for helping with some of the logistics. And then Rhonda Woolsey, who I'll plug, is one of our students as well as staff members here at the university, who's in charge of special events, catering services, and Josh Stallings up at the top, who's helped us with technology. So I want to thank all of them for helping this. Lastly, no kidding, there's food up there, no food left behind. Please eat. Our panelists will make their way up there, and feel free to mix and mingle and ask them the questions that maybe you didn't get to ask. So thanks again for coming, and we'll see you in the lobby.